welcome to Documental. I'm your host and producer, Whitney Fishburne. And on this episode, I speak with Dr. Scott Aaronson, a psychiatrist and the head of clinical research at the Shepard Pratt Institute in Baltimore County, Maryland. Dr. Aaronson has been tapped to lead a new multidisciplinary mental health treatment facility at the Shepard Pratt campus in Towson, Maryland, backed by Compass Pathways, a UK-based company and major funder of psychedelic research, specifically psilocybin. Dr. Aaronson is my first guest in a series dedicated to exploring how psychedelics might hold the key not just to changing mental health care, but also democracy.
It's so great to see you. I'm trying to remember the last time I saw you at a meeting. I think it was 2007.
I have a feeling it was an ACNP meeting like 2 years ago, maybe. It
was a while ago. So let me introduce you. Dr. Scott Aaronson, you're the Director of Clinical Research at Shepard Pratt. Is it actually the city? Is it Baltimore? I know you're going to eventually be in Towson, but...
Well, we are in Towson, but we're in Baltimore County.
You're in Baltimore County, okay. And the reason I wanted to have you on Documental was because you have recently been tapped to lead the Center of Excellence, specifically it's going to be very multidisciplinary for treatment-resistant depression, but in particular, what's of interest to me is the Center of Excellence that will be focused on psilocybin research. What's actually going to transpire at this new Center of Excellence? Let's talk about this.
Let me take a running leap at this.
Sure.
So psychedelics had been compounds that were investigated scientifically, and particularly for mental health indications, and actually particularly for substance abuse indications up until the early 70s. And there was a series of okay articles that at least were incredibly suggestive that the use of psychedelics, particularly LSD and psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. There was evidence to suggest that people with substance abuse disorders, particularly alcoholism, had a particularly positive response to the use of psychedelics, and that for many people, it actually gave them remission. And there were studies that were looking at people who were dosed, and 12 months later, they were still in remission and at a much higher rate than we had found from almost any other indication. And what happened is decisions were made. Our president at the time was Richard Nixon, and a decision was made to make these substances officially illegal, and even to the point of illegality that you couldn't even study them. And so we have really not had access to investigating what the potential uses were. And as well, we were fed an incredible amount of misinformation about what the effect is from using psychedelics in the 70s. And so much was a reaction to a particularly charismatic guy, Timothy Leary, who was all about trying to get, or at least was positing what would happen if we put psychedelics in the water supply, and everybody getting along great. And at some point, Nixon labeled him as the most dangerous man in America. What it was is it was actually a government reaction to trying to suppress that there was any evidence for the utility of this. So they invented a whole story that was not based in any science as to what the deleterious effects were. And I still remember hearing reports, because all this, I started college in 1972. So this was part of what you got the idea that, psychedelics caused chromosomal damage. And there was really no evidence for it, but that was posited and wound up getting a place in the lay media.
Now you're doing the research on this, and I want to get the actual context that you're doing the research in. I want to make sure that my audience understands that. But as a researcher, now at the vanguard of this, did you have to establish studies that debunked those fake studies or those fake, whatever they were?
Well, when you actually look at scientific evidence, you don't find any evidence of chromosomal damage. So when you're actually looking at it through a scientific eye and not just as you're trying to, sell whatever malarkey you're trying to sell, there is no evidence of this. There was a small group of folks who were still able to do psychedelic research. And I think of a fellow by the name of Bill Richards, who was one of the real grandfathers of psychedelic research and is still out there. But there were a couple of researchers who were still doing it and keeping this flame alive. There were a couple of groups, and again, it was literally just a couple of groups that had FDA permission to look at psychedelics. And I think that the thing really caught fire with the publication of a couple of papers. And this is actually not until about 2006. That a group out of Hopkins, led by Roland Griffiths, and a group out of New York, both published papers about what the effect of psilocybin was on terminal cancer patients. It was an open label study, but there was pretty good evidence, albeit from two small studies, that they were able to make these people who were highly anxious and quite miserable by virtue of their illnesses. And it led them to greater acceptance and greater appreciation for the last months or years of their lives.
So you've just set up a lot of things that we can go back and explore, but let's talk about what it is that you are now going to head up. Talk to us about this new Center of Excellence and why psychedelics, essentially psilocybin, but psychedelic research is critical to its success, or going to be. It's anticipated that it will be. Well,
if you look at all of us who are now doing psychedelic research, all of us have come from somewhat different pathways. So you look at Roland Griffiths at Hopkins. He really came from the pathway of really being a pharmacologist interested in substances. He's a PhD, but God bless him, he got interested in psychedelics 20 years ago and really has reopened the door for this kind of work. There are other folks who have come in through the idea of developing a new treatment paradigm for post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's where Rick Doblin and the people from MAPS. Well,
let's tell everybody what MAPS is. It's the I wrote it down to make sure we talked about it, because they're in the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies is MAPS.
And this is a group started by Rick Doblin, another hero of mine. And it's a not-for-profit group that basically has, I forget what anniversary they just celebrated, but I think it might have even been their 30-year anniversary, God bless Rick, of trying to look at the use of MDMA, which is commonly known by folks as Molly or ecstasy, MDMA for use with psychotherapy to help people with PTSD. They have a phase 2 trial, meaning that they've done some nice research. They're in the process of actually doing a registration trial, which they hope will lead to FDA approval, of looking at MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. And Rachel Yehuda is in charge of that. And Rachel's really coming from a background of PTSD.
And you come from the background of treatment-resistant depression.
And so if you look at what my research is these days, it's actually looking at either really novel drugs, meaning drugs that are not that don't operate through the monoamine system, meaning that they're not operating through serotonin, norepinephrine, or dopamine, that they're working through other novel systems, neurostimulation. And more recently was invited to be a site for a study done by a company called Compass Pathways, was invited to be a site for their phase 2 trial of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. And I think what happened is that both the folks at Compass as well as me recognized that there was an interesting synergy. Because there is a huge potential for psilocybin to be a really novel intervention in treatment-resistant mood disorders. And again, back to Roland Griffiths. Roland and his group published a paper just a couple of months ago in one of the major journals, and I think it was in JAMA Psychiatry, on a small study that they did on treatment-resistant depression. So one of the big issues for Compass has been not just can they demonstrate that psilocybin combined with psychotherapy can work in a number of different conditions, but can they figure out how you deliver care? How do you change what the treatment paradigm is in all of mental health? Mm-hmm. And I am very fortunate to be at a very large institution that treats a very large number of people across the psychiatric diagnostic spectrum. And so when Compass decided they wanted to get a foothold in developing a center that would be capable of working with them to invent what this new care model may look like, they asked if we'd be willing to do this. And so I think we finally hammered out an agreement. And so we are now their first center of excellence in the world. But again, the goal is not just to see whether psilocybin helps. It's really to figure out how do we make it help the most? How do we look at it throughout all of psychiatry? So we'll be looking actually at other indications than just treatment-resistant depression.
Such as bipolar 2, and then I think OC forms of anxiety.
What I currently have all cleared is a study looking at folks with mood instability that meet the criteria for what's called bipolar 2 depression, meaning that these are folks who have a cyclical depressive illness that only they generally don't get into trouble on the high side. All the trouble they get into is on the low side, but they cycle in and out of depression and may have some small hypomanic bumps. I'm also looking at folks who are actually too sick for the larger treatment-resistant depression trial. So I'm actually concentrating on folks who have failed at least 5 different treatments in the current episode.
So that's your specialty, actually. I remember talking with you in the past about people who failed every other possibility, and then you were doing neurostimulation with them. So are these really large studies then? What's your number for?
There's a master study that Compass is looking at, which is a randomized trial of 3 different doses of psilocybin. That's an international study. That's relatively large. Most of my studies are relatively small, and we're generally looking at 15 to 20. I can imagine we may have some studies that are looking at 30 patients, or we may decide to work with some of the other centers and have a larger patient base. Right now, these studies that I'm writing the protocols for are generally open label studies, and they really would be viewed mostly as a proof of concept study. Is, can we demonstrate that there is any impact on these illnesses?
So then once you get this underway, what do you think will be the timeline for whether or not you'll have a treatment to roll out, and then would be talking about having to create policies that support its people having access to it?
Boy, beats me. I'm just a simple country psychopharmacologist. I'm assuming we're looking at several years. We would need to have a pivotal study that was approved by the FDA, and probably 2 pivotal studies before we'd be able to support an application for approval of psilocybin. So we're looking at several years. Obviously, we're also watching lots and lots of people jockeying for position here.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to that. I want to, so you're familiar with the research of others that have gone before you. One name you didn't mention, and I'm curious if you are familiar with his work, is Stanislav Grof, and his yes-no, is that a...
Yeah, I won't say that I have an intimate familiarity with his work. It certainly has been one of the real godfathers of psychedelics.
Yeah, and his interest is the use of it for transpersonal psychiatry and kind of the more spiritual end of things. There's also a book that's come out recently, The Immortality Key by Brian Murarescu. Are you familiar with this book?
I'm not.
It basically says that psychedelics go all the way back to the Temple of Dionysus and were the actual core of what are now Christian and particularly Catholic and Episcopalian Eucharist services. And he raises the question as to whether or not it was the Romans who separated psychedelics as a known and accepted by society part of ritual for the sake of communion with God. And he's definitely created a stir in the Catholic Church and questions about whether or not this is key or should have been key to religion. And when I read the studies of people who describe their experiences in these types of studies, invariably they talk about a spiritual event of some kind. And I'm finding, I would like to ask you your thoughts on that, because that will lead us in some really interesting directions when it comes to how do you put gates and fences and therefore policy around people who are having spiritual experiences. So have you, what are your thoughts on that as part of this new field that you're entering?
Yeah, and it's a funny new field because I have never studied a compound where there are so many opinions and so many people so sure of what I really should be doing.
Like who? And what do you mean by that?
There are certain camps that have decided that, psychedelics should all be approved. It shouldn't have to go through any kind of regulatory process. And haven't you guys already decided that it works?
Well, is that because it's it's essentially it's a therapeutic molecule that predates, nobody discovered it, or created it. And maybe is that the type of argument that they're making to you?
No, I get more the argument, there's already some kind of open label evidence base, and we should be able to go just with that. There's this really funny kind of schism going on. People are talking about this drug as being consciousness raising. And the problem is that all my dealings with the FDA, I would be very surprised if they would ever approve a drug because it made you more spiritual. As a psychiatrist, I'm interested in treating psychiatric illnesses and in making things available to folks that will lessen illness burden. So while I find it fascinating that part of the effect of the use of these drugs is in fact a greater sense of communion with others or a higher sense of spirituality, that's not ultimately what we need to demonstrate in our studies.
It does, however, seem to be a prevalent enough, I wouldn't even call it side effect. It may even turn out to be one of the, the desired effects
Oh, well, I think it is intimately related to the improvement that you see.
Right. It makes
Because,
me,
and if we can, let's take a step back as to what do we think that these medications are doing physiologically. And two of the main effects that we see is there's something in the brain called the default mode network. And this is a part of the brain that is most active when you're kind of at rest. And what's interesting is a number of different conditions have an increase in activity in the default mode network as if you are painfully ruminative. And my guess is you can come up with a whole handful of those illnesses that make you hyper-focused on your internal sense. Depression,
right.
PTSD, OCD, probably eating disorders, possibly even something like autism. These are things that sort of turn on to a problematic extent activity in the default mode network. And one of the things that we notice that psychedelics do is they actually turn down the default mode network. They enable you to actually get out of that internal rumination and to start to look around more. As well, the other thing that it does is it seems to rapidly increase connectivity in other parts of the brain. So as if you're able to create new synapses relatively quickly. We're looking at hours, not days or months. It's not hard to say, hey, those two effects believably could get somebody out of a depressive state, out of a pathological grief state, out of a over reflection on a past traumatic event. And they permit a greater association with the world around you. And isn't that what part of the religious experience is feeling like you're part of a greater whole?
Yeah, and I think I would say what you're getting at is that it raises the question of whether or not these ruminative states are, I mean, there's no question. I've experienced them and I've seen them. With some of these ruminative states, when you get stuck in them, you'll do whatever you can to get out of them. And if you get help that is pharmaceutical with help from somebody who can guide you through it, you really ought to seriously consider it. However, I have often wondered, and this is the route I took, and I'll be personal, in my own depressions. I had two very severe depressions. I kept asking more questions of myself. I probably suffered far longer than I should have. And maybe I regret that because it put others through some really dark places as well. But I kept looking for the meaning in it. Whether I was wrong isn't really the question I'm bringing to you. What I'm saying is that there are those who would say there is something to be gained from these experiences. And if you create shortcuts around it, or, as I'm going to suggest, you use this psychedelic therapeutic module or modality without the spiritual construct around it, either way, you're depriving a person of an opportunity to derive a very important meaning out of an experience, a very human experience. Weigh in on this.
It's not either or. It's not either I can only get through my grief at the loss of my mom through being in pain for 15 years. I gotta say, being in pain for 15 years, not to me a marvelous opportunity for growth.
That's a long time, though, Scott. That's a long time.
But fine. So is 10 years too long?
I think these are the kinds of questions. No, but what this kind of question that you're asking, this conversation we're having, this is the important kind of conversation that we don't really get to have with policy, I think, because we stay focused on simply the evidence base around the pharmaceutical. And I think what you're doing now is opening up these kinds of questions of, when I finally decide, myself or anybody, 3 years is too long, 2 years is too long, I'm not getting anything out of this, I do want help, I need to have access to it instead of having to go through all of the different trials and all of the different formularies in order to arrive at the place where I can say, okay, now you have the modality, I've done all this other garbage that didn't help me, we knew wasn't going to help me, and now I can finally get access to what will probably help me.
And let's bear in mind what this model is. This model of use of psychedelics is an integrative model, and for the first time, I'd argue, an integrative model of psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy. And
how will it work?
I think so much of my main functioning with my research is figuring out who understands the parameters of what I can do during a trial and figuring out who the best patients are. And by best patients, I'm not talking about that I'm trying to load the deck with I think people who are going to respond. It's really understanding what the modality is that I'm dealing with. And you don't want people with unrealistic expectations that this is going to cure them. Then what we do is we have you meet with one of our therapists, and you actually meet with the therapist 3 times before you have a dosing session. And the purpose of that is to educate what's the process like, what can you expect. I've also got, bear in mind, I'm doing both randomized trials and open label studies, and you have to prepare people differently for different studies, because in one study, you will definitely have a psychedelic experience. And in the other study, you may or may not have a psychedelic experience. It's all done with skilled therapists. You have to be in the dosing room with the therapist for 8 or 9 hours. And during that time, actually, the only thing that's really done is support. The point is to stay open to the experience, and you have this experience, which at times can be incredibly intense. And then the next day you come back. Well, I check in on everybody after their dosing session, make sure that they're safe to leave. They go home in the care of a significant other. They come back the next day and they begin to process their experience. Usually 2 or 3 integration sessions to kind of make sense of what happened, what did they learn. One of the things that you'll see when you look at some of the data is some people have reported continuing to get benefit from this experience a year or so after this.
Define the endpoint for us.
Well, right now I'm using pretty quick endpoints. My primary endpoint for a lot of my work is 3 weeks after dosing. As you can imagine, this is also different work than I've ever done, and I was involved actually in the early trials of fluoxetine of Prozac. Now I've got a study in which I'm not necessarily as interested if your sleep and your appetite is better. I'm really looking, how do you feel about yourself and your place in the world?
Yeah.
And we don't have terrific scales yet for that.
Right.
So you're not going to get a lot of terrific support out of me that we've done a great job typifying mental health disorders, because psychiatric diagnosis is completely phenomenological. Mm-hmm. It's based on how somebody appears, not what their underlying illness is. And there is that tendency, as well, to want to pathologize things. And my mom passed away over 30 years ago. I still miss her. Is that pathology?
No, I don't think that it is. I'll just say it. You're a psychiatrist. Do you think it is?
I don't think it is. I think it's the good fortune that I had to have a good mom.
But let's just stop right there and talk about this, because when you're saying that, it does open that up again to ask what are going to be the criteria now for who's the right candidate for this treatment, even if it's passed and we get it through the FDA and so forth. It will remain phenomenological, won't it? What biology?
I do hope that psychiatry does become more biologic, and I do hope that we are able to develop better criteria. And I've been existing within this framework my whole career. I guess I can manage to do it for a few more years. But I do think that we have to expand our vision of this. On another issue, the psychiatric group in Australia and New Zealand came out with a position paper that basically said that one of the neurostimulation techniques that is approved by the FDA doesn't really work and shouldn't be considered. I was asked to provide a vision from the US as to what they were doing in Australia. And a friend of mine made the wonderful comment, which I think is attributed to Max Planck, where he said, "Science advances one funeral at a time."
Oh dear.
And the important part of this is that, yes, this is a whole new thing that a number of us are involved with that may change our perception about mental illness, may change our perception about how we treat it. And, don't try to rein us in by antiquated ideas and notions about illness that may not fit this new paradigm that we're in.
That's what I'm interested in particularly. And I think a couple of minutes ago, you said something about, not evaluating the way a person feels about their place in the world. Did I get that right? How you said that?
I think that, the point is that there's a number. Let me give you the example of somebody that was in one of my studies. His mood was getting worse again, called me up, wanted to figure out what we should do about it. And he, out of the study, had finished it a year before. And I said, "Is anything still any different?" And he said, "I still don't hate my parents." That doesn't show up on any scale.
No, it doesn't. So what was your reaction? Did that get you to think about maybe there are things that you can't scale, that you can't, survey for?
Well, we need to figure out how to survey for those things. And that's one of the other things. You and I spoke a bunch about my research with an implantable device, a vagus nerve stimulator. Yeah. And I have a feeling this paper came out subsequent to one of our last conversations, but you even cited something that I told you then about somebody who didn't meet criteria of response based on having been implanted with this device, this vagus nerve stimulator. But if you asked her whether the quality of her life had changed, she no longer woke up every morning feeling like she should kill herself and enjoyed riding her bicycle. And if you questioned whether this was a meaningful difference, she was really pretty clear. This is a meaningful difference.
But she could not avail herself of those techniques of the vagus nerve stimulator. She wouldn't be able to avail herself of the psilocybin. In other words, if they don't meet the criteria of the evidence base as it's set forth by the endpoint, insurance companies say, well, then I don't have to pay for it. You're not eligible for this, but it still works.
Well, I'm happy to say, and I'm not sure if you realize this, on the basis of the paper I published on VNS in 2017, is Medicare is funding a current study, something called coverage with evidence development, in which we'll be implanting up to 1,000 people in the U.S. Who are Medicare recipients with treatment-resistant either unipolar or bipolar illness. So we will make it more available, but I do think we still need to change our criteria. We need to change our criteria for how we're looking at treatment-resistant depression. And I've tried to adjust for the coming study so that we're able to capture, so what if you don't get over the barrier of 50% better, you're 40% better. And I think that I'm working on, and one of my projects is to figure out how do I capture what my folks are telling me. So coming up, there's a meeting of the International Society for CNS Researchers. And one of the questions, and one of the work breakout groups we're going to have is, how do you look at something that may make you better in 24 hours?
Like this, or like ketamine, or
like this, or like, and I'll give you the example of somebody that was in one of my open label studies. And so to qualify, as I mentioned, she had to have failed at least 5 treatments in the current episode, which she did. And I saw her after she got dosed, asked her how she was doing, how she felt. And she said, every day for the past several years, I've known I would wake up the next morning depressed. I don't have to feel that way.
So these kinds of studies and these kinds of study subjects who report these kinds of experiences really fascinate me, because I'm wondering, does anybody ever study what they have in common beyond their biology? In other words, are they people who are, now with epigenetics, and this is going to get a little woo-woo, but I still wonder, do they carry the traumas that came from their families and they just haven't had them triggered, but they still have this kind of genetic memory of something? Do they have that in common? Is there a way to study for that? Are these people who you're helping them feel biologically better, but are they living in situations now of despair? We have this entire nation reacting in these crazy ways to the fact that access to resources is very limited and it's getting tighter. And is the fact that people know that somewhere there is an existential moment that they're going to have to face. And this is what's promoting these kinds of treatment-resistant depressions, that, one day I'm never going to have a job, or I'm going to be too old to find a job again. And then what do? I don't have a plan for that. Or access to fresh water in my community is not happening ever again. It's polluted. These are the kinds of questions that we don't take into effect when we're looking at mental health policies. And I think we're just going to go around in circles until we start talking about these things.
Well, one of the things you and I know is that one of the things about depression is you take the same person with the same stuff on their plate, and based on whether they're depressed or not, they have a very different vision as to what's on their plate, as to whether it is inedible or a feast. And I think that, and I actually think personally that existential despair, which is not something we generally have been able to address particularly well with any of our current pharmacologic interventions, I actually wonder if that's a specifically good target for psychedelics. We can't change the universe people are existing in, but we may be able to change how they're coping with the universe or their attitudes about the universe. And
does that play God? Does that mean that you're now playing God? Do you have an ethical question about that?
Now you're back to Peter Kramer's book, Listening to Prozac, which is, are we making people who really, are we making people unrealistically happy?
Well, is it an unrealistic question then? Is it a naive question?
I think that, the problem is, and one of the key bases of all of research is, what's the right question?
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that. And I think what you're doing makes that really important more than ever.
And I think that I have to be honest, is I'm still formulating what the right question really is as to what is the effect of psychedelics. What I'm fascinated by is how many people are darn sure they know what the answer to the question is, but they really don't. But I do think it forces us to change our conception as to what it means to be ill and what kind of interventions we can have to alleviate people from suffering. Yeah. Am I going to take away all suffering in the world? Absolutely not. If I can relieve some of the suffering from those people who have been mourning the loss of a loved one for that has painfully gotten in their way and has rendered them unable to function for years, I don't have a question. And I think it's incredibly naive when people say, well, you've pathologized grief. No. I'm trying to relieve suffering. I'm not trying to say somebody has an illness that doesn't really exist. And I do think that there are so many people who misunderstand. And so much of the misunderstanding of psychiatry is because we still don't really understand the biologic basis of the illnesses we treat. Nobody is going to yell at somebody who's diabetic to tell them, if you were a better person, your pancreas would make more insulin. We don't do this. We do yell at people because they can't get out of bed, or we do yell at people because they're predisposed towards alcoholism. And the problem is these are actual illnesses that, while we don't understand the biology for completely, we do have some tools like neuroimaging and like genetics that we understand may predispose people to it. And, and here's back to effing politics. Something isn't true or not true because you believe it.
Correct.
If you've been able to verify it.
Yeah, that's bidirectional, Scott. That goes both ways. I see, and I struggle against this, and I think that what you're doing actually brings these kinds of questions to the forefront in policy debates, which is where they belong. I see scientists actually act that way too. Like, well, this is what I've seen with my evidence-based perspective on things, and that's all there is. But you are already starting to elucidate. There is a point at which we don't know what we don't know, and science may not ever deliver the answers to us about those things. Am I misrepresenting?
But it's silly to react with nihilism and just say, then I won't bother taking a look at.
That's true too. But that is where you start getting into the ethics and the morality questions, which I don't expect that you can answer. Or anyone necessarily can, but we can't not talk about them either.
I don't have ethical issues about relieving the suffering of people with depression. I don't have the fantasy that they will come up with tremendous meaning from their suffering. But
then I'm a white crow, because I did I found meaning in my suffering, and once I found the meaning, I suffered no more. Now, I don't know how that plays out in statistics. The last really bad depression I had was 15 years ago.
And how long did it last for?
About 18 months.
And wouldn't it be cool if at 3 to 6 months, we could have given you some psilocybin and you could have cut to the chase a year sooner?
I would not have been willing to do it, frankly. I'd have been too nervous. It frightens me. The idea of it frightens me. I would not have allowed myself to be a candidate for that. I don't know why that is, frankly. One of the things that Stanislav Grof does that I find really interesting is they looked at the transits astrologically of people to see who was having a good trip and who wasn't, based on what their spiritual, soul map was. And that's where I go, wow. You are going to start asking questions where people are going to come to you and say, hey, soul matters in this. And you can't just say, we need to recuperate and bring back the soul of America, and we must believe in science. We're going to have to find a way to say, yeah, both are really important if we're going to continue down the path of trying to find ways to relieve these deep areas of depression, including the existential depression. I find it fascinating that you're saying this could actually be a field of research where you could alleviate existential depression using this kind of medication. But anyway, to your question, no, I wouldn't have done it.
But I think if we can limit how much people have to suffer, yeah, I'm all for that. But as well, that said, I remember after my mom passed away, there was a piece of me that was incredibly pissed by how much I was learning from the experience.
Wait, that's a really interesting comment. What do you mean? You were mad that it wasn't just going to be, what do you mean? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
What I mean is that, I had my own searches for meaning. Why could I only learn this stuff because she died? I'll give you my Zen moment is my house burned down, and my kids were very little, and we pretty much lost everything we owned. in this house fire. And I felt incredibly sorry for myself. And I was 33 years old and felt like I had lost everything. And a month later, my mom passed away quite suddenly.
Wow. Now, were you thinking that your self-pity was a pathological reaction?
I wasn't thinking about it. I was, I was just trying to keep my family together. And I had, just gone off into practice by myself and had an office to support and all this kind of stuff going on. And I remember that epiphanal moment after my mom passed away, which is as overwhelmed as I was by her loss, is I said, oh, now I lost something I can't replace.
Got it. I see. Mm-hmm. You learned perspective.
Yeah. And, I wasn't dropping any psychedelics at the time. But if I could help people get to those epiphanal moments sooner, oh, sure. That
brings up another question then. Are the psychiatrists who are going to, let's say everything goes the way that your financial backers want it to go, the research, you reach the endpoints, you get through FDA approval, everything lines up. Who is going to be the psychiatrist who is successful at administering this? And do they need a completely different way of being trained and of approaching therapy?
The short answer is yes. And so we're actually training therapists specifically to be psychedelic assisted psychotherapists.
What skill set do they need that's different?
To basically foster the each patient's internal realizations that they're coming to.
Okay, I'm going to be controversial and say I have found that it's difficult, particularly in community psychiatry, to come across through all of the hoops you have to jump through your insurance companies and what you can afford and so on, to find psychiatrists who are that cutting edge and also have the empathy and the necessary human skills to affect what I think is going to be the trickiest modality within, the trickiest subspecialty of psychiatry yet.
Whitney, you just figured out why Compass wants to partner with Sheppard Pratt.
I'm sure that's in a mission statement somewhere I didn't read, but...
No, but the point is that here we are, we're the largest not-for-profit mental health system in the country.
Sheppard Pratt is.
Sheppard Pratt is. And the point is that that's exactly the paradigm I need to figure out. Is how so we've got community programs all over Maryland. How can I roll this out in a way that I'm able to make this available in communities across the socioeconomic spectrum, train people to do this in a way that is thoughtful and supportive? Terrific questions, but it's not just a matter of creating the tool, it's figuring out how best to use that tool. And that's part of what this is. And that, because the whole paradigm for psychedelic therapy is not about getting a drug approved by the FDA. It's the problem you actually just so eloquently voiced. It's how do we change this delivery system that is just involved with 15-minute visits that somehow changing your medication is going to make things dramatically better?
Well, that's one of the reasons why this is exciting to me, is because even though I would never actually do this, not the person I am now, I wouldn't do it. It is so potentially disruptive. If what we're talking about blows up the way that we currently have so much gatekeeping between us and what will deliver us to a less suffering, then I also have to ask, well, who else have we left in the past who successfully administered this? And if the book I referred to, The Immortality Key, actually is correct, and it was the priests and the priestesses, then we really are at the foot of the mountain of soul coming together with science. And maybe the people that you end up having to look to help you in the delivery system are clerics, or people who are trained in people going through spiritual crises.
A dear friend of mine is an Episcopal priest who is also very interested in this whole treatment paradigm. He is also a psychologist. I do think that there is the ability for incredible amounts of cross-fertilization, but it really involves at times a degree of maturity on both sides of the equation that has been difficult to achieve. Part of the reason I value, my friendship with this fellow so much is that he's somebody who does span those worlds.
Well, I actually think that you're pointing to yet another hurdle that I don't know how we get around, or if we're going to get around it when, and that is this level of maturity. Because the maturity that you're talking about is an adult. It's found in an adult who can withstand complexity. And what you and I are talking about can't be codified easily, and it's not simple. Nothing that we're talking about is simple. But if we approach it with the idea that it can be made complex and therefore accessible by people who are approaching it with the idea that we can't just, make it one size fits all, we would probably find that we can deliver it and in ways that is not expensive or that are not preferential to people beyond their actual physical suffering needs.
And I got to tell you, I think that's what the model that Compass wants to have is. And that's part of what the partnership is about, is how do we figure this out? And yeah, wouldn't it be nice to have all adults at the table? The other funny thing is that this is actually an intervention that has had support regardless of political persuasion, albeit there are, always folk, there are people whose main job in life is to rain on other people's parades. But I do think as a skeptical scientist, there's a reason I'm investing basically half of my professional life in the development of this model. And Whitney, I am just curious as all get out, and this is a wonderful example of my life motto that I told you about years ago, which is the two big truths is, number one, I don't always know what I'm doing, and number two, I am never bored. And this satisfies both of those incredible needs. I'm trying to understand better what I'm doing, and boy, I am still never bored. And I think this is an incredible time within all of psychiatry, and I think it is an opportunity to change. And I agree with you that at time, here we are. All these drug companies haven't come out with new antidepressants. Part of my lecture on treatment-resistant depression is between 1959 and 2019, 60 years, every antidepressant that came on the market was a monoamine-based drug.
Well, a lot of it is Me Too development, and I don't mean Me Too in the politicized way that it's become, but I mean like, oh, that's easy, we'll do that too. And it's just the way to make a quick buck.
Absolutely. And the point is these are neurostimulation, NMDA antagonists, this whole class of drugs that ketamine and esketamine are leading, are really novel introductions to the field. And I think psychedelics are as well. And I do think that they have the capacity. I can't promise you it's going to change the paradigm. I think they have the capacity to change the paradigm. And I think it is, I don't think we're far enough along that we've really remarried the soul to psychiatry. but at least we're finally remarrying psychotherapy to psychobiology.
Now, that's a really interesting comment, because, what it was around the time that the National Institute of Mental Health came out. It was when Dr. Insel was there, and he started the research. RDoC was a research domain criteria, where he was trying to push the biological approach to funding psychiatric research. And the American Psychiatric Association essentially responded with changing their logo to include the word soul. And I've often wondered, well, does anybody even really know what that means and what they're looking for, and why, what was the impetus for that? I don't know. And I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying, well, obviously it's important enough to put in your branding, but it's not where people go when they want to publish in order to get tenure, and you've already said the FDA is not going to give a darn whether or not a drug makes you a more spiritual person. That's not what we care about. That's not what we measure. We don't know how to measure it. I mean, I'm just basically recapping our conversation. It's just we don't know what to do with that. We don't even ask those questions. But I think what we're finding is it's leading us there anyway. And it's very fascinating to know what we do when we get to that point. You're going to end up with some kind of clinical result from this. It will beg bigger questions.
Hey, bring it. So I missed my 40th med school reunion because of the pandemic. Boy, I can't imagine being doing anything else in all of medicine, and 40 years later, still loving to go to work and still loving what I do, and absolutely fascinated by what's on the horizon. And yeah, we haven't figured out, where does the soul fit into any of this? I think,
but it's implicit in the name of your field, psychiatry, psyche.
Absolutely, but it's not something we paid attention to. But geez, if we could just get the therapists in the same offices with the prescribing folks, boy, that's a huge achievement. And as well, the other funny thing about psychedelics is they're really transdiagnostic.
In what way? You mean it? Okay, what do you mean?
I mean that this is a potential intervention that can reach across these arbitrarily created diagnostic categories.
Well, don't forget, though, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's important. And again, they are called psychedelics. I believe, our languages often tell us things we forget that we're supposed to hear them tell us. I guess I'm going to go Noam Chomsky on that for a minute and just say, our language, our linguistics, much more communicative to us than we necessarily stop and consider they are. I think in part because we're just bombarded with words all the time and messaging all the time. But you are dealing with a substance that seems to be telling us does workarounds around pain and transcends people and lifts them up and gives them some sense that there is a greater being, that psyche, that psychedelic. And I'm not just saying that because that's wishful thinking on my part, that I want science to go that way. I've been reading what people who've done these studies say, and they even hardcore atheists will tell you, I thought maybe I was in the presence of God. What? Really, this is mind-blowing. And it is mind-blowing.
Hey, there's a reason you wanted to talk to me, and there's a reason I want to do this research, is because it's so provocative. What I think is a terrific book, particularly for the lay public, is Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which is really a terrific description. And God bless him, Michael gets much more of it right than a lot of other folks as to what the history of the development of research in psychedelics has been like. And the other thing I find just incredibly amusing is here is basically a journalist who's now being asked to speak at scientific meetings because at some level, he's got a journalistic appraisal as to what we do as opposed to us who were doing it.
Yeah, but doesn't that speak to the kinds of fear that happens when you get locked in by a system where you're afraid? I think a lot of you, and I know this from talking with you, you'll see things that are happening in your field that you'll comment on them, but a lot of other psychiatrists get afraid of because they will lose something if they talk about it. And I think to have an outsider who, like myself, I don't care. I don't have any tenure I have to worry about. I don't care if I piss off somebody at the APA or piss off you, or I don't want to, but I'm not factoring that in. I'm curious. And I want the curiosity that I bring to this to actually be of service. And I think a journalist such as Pollen saying, hey, there are things happening that are really important and have huge implications for humanity, and I don't need to worry about tenure. Let me ask these questions is a real important public service. But I don't think that's, you're finding humor in it. I'm finding where else is it going to come from? Because the system of academia, the system of clinical research, the system of pharmaceutical companies having their clutches on the actual access to, and then the insurance companies access to, all of those systems make it impossible for the actual free inquiry you're talking about to happen. So I'm not surprised by this.
Well, I feel like I have decided that I had the right to speak my mind, and curiously, I've gotten away with it for a long damn time. I want to trust science. I want to trust what I'm doing. I want to set up the questions in a way that I get meaningful answers, and I want to be able to report on what my findings are in a thoughtful way.
If this is a disruptive technology or a disruptive specialty within your field, what could you predict would change, good or bad?
It's an interesting question. We'll have to change the way we think about mental illness. We will have to change the way we think about how we treat mental illness. I hope that it helps us get beyond the incredible stigma that still exists. There's a number of people who, view the illnesses that we treat as being, evidences of weakness. And geez, my folks are some of the toughest people around.
In other words, you have the most refractory group of patients. In other words, okay.
So even just today, I was asked to look at something, and they had shown me this thing that says, and depression and anxiety disorders are the third leading cause of disability in the world. And I said, no, you're wrong. It's the number one leading cause of disability in the world. We're not number three, we're number one. And despite that, we still have prejudices against treating it.
Part of the reason why we want to make sure that stays low on people's priority of treatment is because then you do start opening up those questions that we talked about earlier. Well, maybe the person is depressed because they don't have a chance in hell of living a life where they're not under attack somehow, where their neighborhood isn't an unsafe place, or their ability to put food on the table isn't threatened every single day.
Oh, Whitney, that's a whole different kettle of fish, because absolutely, and there's a reason why different illnesses present within different ethnic populations, because hot damn, you don't know if at a traffic stop that could be your last.
If you're a young black man and you get pulled over, yeah,
that's going to change your vision. And so if you get ill, you may become more paranoid looking. And the same. I think that there's a reason that we diagnose more black folks with psychiatric illness with schizophrenia, because there tends to be more of a paranoid flavor, and I think to a large extent due to that experience.
Well, I also wonder, though, if it's that epigenetic thing. If you look at GWAS studies, genome-wide association studies, I've always been fascinated by GWAS studies, because you'll see things like, those metaphors that jump out at you. And maybe this is too simplistic, but I see them. So Eastern European Jews have higher rates of inflammatory bowel disease. Well, they spent a good portion of their lifetime on that continent with people hating their guts, right? Blacks also, they have these gut conditions that you see in these GWAS studies, where no matter where they come from, it's ethnic. There are these ethnically described illnesses. These are the kinds of questions that our policies have to take into consideration when we look at what you're studying and we're looking at what you're doing. And we're not asking the right questions because it doesn't serve the same population. I had a person say to me recently, this will encapsulate what I'm getting at: science is for rich people. It serves rich people's aims. I'm not saying it does, but it's a really interesting way to look at things.
I will say that part of our aim is to actually expand our work into inner city populations. Turns out Baltimore has an inner city. We actually need to upset the entire research paradigm, the psychiatric diagnosis paradigm, and the psychiatric care delivery paradigm. It seems like a lot, but
Get busy.